Hello! You may have heard of Live2D, but not many people know what it actually is or how it's used. First, I'll start with a general description of what Live2D is so you can understand why it's a useful skill to have. Live2D is typically used by content creators like YouTubers and streamers who want to use a simulated avatar to represent them instead of their face. This is done for a number of reasons, ranging from self-esteem issues to marketing schemes. To some people, creating content using a simulated face is a method of escapism that allows them to play a character that they have total control over the image of. These content creators are called VTubers, which is short for virtual YouTuber. While some people choose to have their avatars made in 3D, many people appreciate the look of 2D models instead. Both of these options are incredibly pricey, with higher-end models costing anywhere from $2,000 to $8,000 or more. The reason behind this is that all forms of artistic creation take an incredible amount of hard work, effort, dedication, knowledge, and time. This means that if someone wants to commission a 2D model, they'll be responsible for paying for both the complicated art process and the technically challenging rigging process. I myself have been very interested in going down a route of 2D VTubing as a hobby. However, it's nearly impossible for someone of my age to scrape together enough money to commission a model. I already knew how to draw, so in early 2021, I committed myself to learning Live2D and was able to find lessons on using the software. Today, I'm going to share with you what I've learned. Every inch of this software is riddled with difficulty and surprises. From the drawing process to the exportation, you'll need to be acutely aware of everything you're doing in order to get the model you want. So, I'll start with the drawing process. Live2D works by programming specific movements for every piece of your avatar. In order to make your virtual eyes blink, you'll need to have defined eyelashes that can move downward independently from the nose, hair, or even the eye whites. So every single feature must be explicitly separated throughout the artwork. The mouth and eyes are the most complicated parts to separate. Some people rig by separating every single tooth, however I've chosen not to do this because this would make the rigging process 10 times more complicated. So, instead, I've simplified the process for the sake of this tutorial by only including top and bottom teeth. Each of these individual parts will be referred to as textures. On top of these, you'll also need to separate the tongue and the back part of the mouth, as well as the top and bottom lips. It's difficult to explicitly say which parts should be separated, so the best rule of thumb is to just ask yourself what body parts you want to be able to move independently of each other. There are also a number of tutorials online that show exactly how to separate certain features or bodies. Most simple models will have around 100 textures, whereas more expensive and complicated models may have upwards of 500. Some people draw one unified sketch and then line each texture separately, but I find it much easier to sketch each texture first so that I don't have to separate them later. This does make the sketching process take longer, but will make the lining process easier for me. It also depends on personal preference. Regardless, though, you should make sure to title every texture layer and sort them into folders so that you can easily identify them once exported to Live2D. While drawing, I try to use the symmetry tool on every texture that permits it, like the face shape or bodice. I'm not drawing the right eye here because with my premium membership with Live2D, I can just copy and paste it in the program once it's already rigged to save myself so much time. Also, make sure to draw slightly more than what you expect to be shown on screen. If you want the shoulders up to be shown, it'll be a good idea to draw from the chest up instead. Some people even draw full body models, but for the sake of time, I'll be drawing from the chest up. Once you finish drawing your model and have all your features separated, you can save the file as a .psd, that's a Photoshop document, which is the only file that can be read by the Live2D program. However, you don't need to use Photoshop in order to save it as a .psd. I used Fire Alpaca here, which is completely free to use. Once you've exported the file into Live2D, there's tons of preparation that you have to do before you can even begin rigging. First, you'll notice that any textures using a clipping mask to a texture below them have been unclipped. To clip them in Live2D, you need to copy the layer ID of the lower texture and paste it into the clip texture's clipping ID. Next, you'll want to organize your parameters. Parameters are the sliding bars used to save your model's movement, piece by piece, as you separately rig the eyes, mouth, eyebrows, and body movements. You might have some parameters that you'll want to delete. For example, I will not be utilizing the cheek parameter, which is used to make your model's cheeks puff out. You can also add new parameters. For example, some riggers add secondary body movements, like Z2, which gives your model a wider range of movement from side to side. However, any parameters added cannot be tracked by the camera, since face tracking softwares like VTube Studio, which I'll be using, only know how to utilize the parameters preset by Live2D. If you do choose to add extra parameters like Z2, you can have those movements set to keyforms on your keyboard once you're in the face tracking software, which will allow you to trigger them with a combination of keys on your keyboard rather than having the camera track your movement. You can sort all of your parameters into folders that you can rename and even change the color of, which will allow you to much more easily navigate your work and sort them into priority lists. I choose to keep the body and head movement at the top because I prefer rigging those first. Lastly, you'll want to edit the deformer dots in deformer hierarchy. Deformer dots are the dots assigned to each texture, which you can automatically place on your whole model at once by pressing Ctrl-A and then setting the deformer dots. It's a good idea to stick with medium because heavy will overwhelm your computer and possibly crash the program, and light will not give you enough control over the texture. Even with the medium deformer dot setting, some textures won't be properly set up, so it's a good idea to head in and manually edit the deformer dots. The textures that I do this most with are the eyelashes, lips, nose, hair, and any other textures that will have physics applied directly to them. For example, my model's hoodie drawstrings. The deformer hierarchy consists of what deformers exist inside what parent deformers. You can't rig your whole model just using the dots, so there are two different kinds of deformers that you can use to make your model move. Warp deformers do exactly what they say. They can warp the texture to make it change in shape, like how I made my model's face turn to the side. It was the same texture, just compressed and stretched in such a way that it looked like it turned to the side. Rotation deformers are also pretty self-explanatory. They can rotate your texture. It's not a good idea to try and rotate a texture with a warp deformer because each of the deformer dots on a warp deformer move on a linear scale. That means if you try to rotate the deformer, it'll shrink and grow before reaching its final destination. The rotation deformer allows you to control the texture without it shrinking. However, the downside of this is that it locks the texture's shape. This means that if you put a rotation deformer inside of a warp deformer, the texture underneath will not be able to warp alongside the deformer, only move in accordance to how the warp deformer changes the position of the rotation deformer. The deformer hierarchy allows you to put deformers inside of deformers, which gives you more opportunities to widen the model's range of motion. For example, I can put the bangs into a warp deformer that will control their physics, and then put that deformer inside another warp deformer that will control how the bangs move connected to the face movement. The face movement deformer will be put inside another deformer, which will be used to pull the hair downward when the head tilts to one side. That deformer will then be placed inside the head's side-to-side movement rotation deformer alongside the face, eyes, mouth, nose, etc. deformers that will also be moving with the head. This head rotation deformer then gets put inside the body's breathing deformer, which will be put inside the... you get the idea. Each individual texture will have a similar long list of deformers inside of deformers that allow it to move appropriately and extensively, even though some of them can be rigged right on their base deformer dots, like the eyelashes. Once the deformer hierarchy is all set up, you can finally begin rigging. I couldn't explain what each individual parameter is for because that would take hours, but there are plenty of free tutorials online that explain what each parameter should do to the model. Each individual deformer should only be attached to one or two parameters at most, otherwise it'll get really tricky to ensure every single keyform will work accordingly in reference to every other keyform. Keyforms are the dots of reference points on the parameters that allow you to save the deformers at a certain state. It's important to make sure you have the right deformer selected before creating your keyforms because each individual deformer will have its own functions and need to be specifically attached to their respective parameters. Live2D is a free program, but with limits. With a monthly or annually paid membership, you can do almost anything with the software, which is what allows me to copy and paste the left features of my model instead of rigging them separately. Unfortunately, if you don't have a membership, you'll have to find other ways to mirror the rigging perfectly, but to my knowledge, it is possible with enough elbow grease. The free version also limits how many deformers you can use and how many models you can have open at once, but it is possible to rig incredible models with just the free version. Once your model is completed with rigging, you can open the physics window and begin setting up physics. You should create a new group for each individual part of the physics, which will allow them to move independently of each other. I'll make separate physics groups for the drawstrings, bangs, side hair, and ponytail. The Input tab controls what will directly trigger the physics. Since the ponytail is on the back of my model's head, it would make sense for the head's X, Y, and Z movement to make the ponytail wave. It will also have a reaction to the body's movement, but at a smaller scale, so I can make the input number for the body's parameters lower than that of the head's parameters. If you don't slide up the input, then they won't have any effect on the physics at all. In the Output tab, you'll have to set your pendulums before you can add your output parameters. Pendulums will visualize how the physics will affect the parameters and give a frame of reference for how aggressively the physics will react. Most physics can only have 2 pendulums, but some have 3. Generally, you shouldn't add more than 3 because it might get too complicated to control the output. You can add the parameters that will fall under your physics group. For my ponytail, it'll be hair move back 1 and hair move back 2. Their output is automatically set to 100, but I lower that to give them a more personalized response to the pendulum settings. Changing the pendulum settings is what will make the physics parameters react differently to the input parameters. Each customizable category changes something different about how the pendulums interact, and they're really difficult to get a grasp on. Even now, I have to experiment with changing each category in order to understand what mix of raising and lowering numbers works for me, so just practice with it and eventually you'll find a combination that looks good to you. However, the physics window won't look exactly like the exported version of the file. One rule of thumb is to keep the projected output under 100. This can be really tricky to control, so you need to tinker with the pendulum settings until you get at least under 110. If you can't seem to bring the output under 100, you might want to shrink the input ranges. Once your physics are all set up, you're done with the rigging process. Now, all you need to do is set up your texture atlas. You'll hit Ctrl-T and be given a few options about how you'd like the atlas to lay out. The program can set it up for you, but you'll need to choose the size of the canvas since this is where all your textures will be laid out together. I've been told to not let the texture atlas get over 4K by 4K to save resources. However, if you want a high-resolution model, you'll need to draw on a large canvas, so most of my texture atlases end up being just over 4K by 4K anyway. It's alright if the full atlas isn't used, as long as all of your textures are laid out on the square and not overlapping. You can rotate and change the location of the textures, but be wary to not let them overlap because then they'll show up as overlapping once the model is exported into a tracking software. Make sure none of the textures are on the sidebar, or else they won't show up in the tracking software. Once you're done, click OK and it'll save into the file. After this, you're ready to hit File, Export for Runtime, and save as .mach3. Make sure to export it into a distinctive folder either in a Live2D centered folder or on your desktop to keep good track of it. These files should be kept in a folder separate from the .cmo3 files used to save your working data. Lastly, you need to export it into a tracking software. I'm quite partial to VTube Studio, which is free on Steam, or $15 if you want to get rid of the watermark. Once it's in your Steam library, open its files. Go from VTube Studio data to stream assets to Live2D models, and you'll copy and paste the folder with all your model files into there. The .mach3, not the CMO3. Don't just drag the folder in, make sure they are separate copies of the model files just to be extra careful. Once these files are in VTube Studio, you can open it from Steam and scroll through the thumbnails at the bottom until you find the one with your model's file's name on it. Once you click on that, you can have the program set up the model for you, which will basically just allow it to start reacting to your face in real time. Every time you open VTube Studio, you should recalibrate since the position of your face and computer change every time you open it again. This will just give the tracking software the information it needs to identify your default expression in reference to you smiling, blinking, leaning, etc. One last thing I like to do in setting up my models for tracking is deactivate the movement config. This makes the model's placement on screen move in response to you moving. For example, leaning on the right will shift the placement of your model, so deactivating this keeps the model still while its body movements can do all the work. And there you have it, a face-tracked Live2D model.